Hi everyone, and welcome to the Superfeeler podcast. My name is Laurie, and I'm joined today by a new friend, Bora, who I am so excited to have join us. She's come to a couple Superfeeler sessions before, and just love her already. So Bora is going to be talking a little bit about her experience in a highly technical field like engineering, and of course living with borderline personality disorder and as a Superfeeler. So really excited to have you, Bora. Over to you.
It's kind of been a ride for me. I would say that I kind of almost want to divide my life as in pre and post immigration to the United States, because I think that that was kind of pivotal for my developing my PD. I think before I was surrounded by a lot of family. I just remember that time being really warm and just really just such a great experience for me.
Do you mind just saying where you're from?
Yeah, I'm from Albania, so like the Balkans, Eastern Europe. Definitely a lot warmer than, Eastern US, but that's where I am now. But it was really like just constantly surrounded by community. In that part of the world, it tends to be very poor, politically unstable. So we actually came here by winning the lottery. Instead of winning money, you could win tickets to start a new life here. And my mother brought us here. Yeah.
Wow, that's so crazy. That seems like a
wild.
movie plot. Wow.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's when I tell people that in the US, I think we often take a lot of our privileges for granted in parts of the world. And I know Albania is not the only one of them. The biggest, most amazing thing that could happen to you is coming to the US. And I think that as a kid, I definitely had a very sort of idealized version of what life here was like. Fast forward to me, my mom and my dad coming here. It's a bit of a rude awakening for me. Obviously, I dressed a little bit differently. I had an accent. Obviously, I had different customs, and we ended up settling in a small town of people who had sort of generationally been there. Like their grandparents knew each other, they all knew each other. And so I was I was ostracized, and then severely like bullied for probably about the next 8 years of my life, where I kind of alternated initially between like trying to change myself to sort of fit more of what they did, how they dress, their hobbies. I lost my accent very quickly, but obviously that wasn't quite enough, because that wasn't really the issue there. It was just inherent xenophobia that was just present in that town. And then I remember probably about the third grade, like something in me snapped, and I went from I need to get these people to see that I'm one of them to I don't really care. And I started fighting back. And I would say that I really identified with someone else who had been on this podcast for kind of the aggression side of things, and how his experiences with borderline really like resulted in him having anger issues kind of early on in his childhood. That was the case for me. I've kind of gone back and forth.
Remember what that was?
I think it was
Is that
Connor.
Connor?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I think so too. Okay, cool. Just so that way people can help, like it can help them go back and find it.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, totally. And I really identified with that. I have done a lot of process work, and I do think that that was maybe, and I know it's totally controversial, but I do think that was like the beginnings of my BPD starting to show through, because it didn't happen unprovoked. It was always someone said or did something that was inherently invalidating or harmful to me, and like my reaction was just out of line. However,
Yeah, the reaction is like, because I had so many issues with violence and aggression before as
mhm,
well, and like the reaction is obviously disproportionate to the trigger, but there's still a trigger.
yeah.
It's not like you're just like losing it for no reason. it might seem like no reason to people around you though, because the triggers
Yes.
are so small, seemingly.
Yes, and, like, coming from that
Mhm.
school system was especially terrible because, again, for people who had, like, generationally been there, um, they all knew each other to the extent of, like, they knew school administrators. So, like, I would often have kids that would, like, pick on me, that would insult my mother, things like that, and I remember one instance of, like, it was complete self-defense. He was winding up to hit me, and I just happened to be faster, and they were going to let him in, but suspend me. So there was a lot of issues like that that kind of resulted in me feeling like everything I did was wrong, that I was just always in the wrong, even if it to me, when I would sit there and kind of process it later, was just me fighting back. I was in a constant state of fight or flight, which was just exceptionally terrible for me. By the time I got to high school, things improved. Throughout my time in middle school, I'd always been considered academically gifted and in advanced placement courses. So I got into a sort of magnet high school. It was an academies program, and that was like a breath of fresh air because nobody there knew each other. It was like almost like getting into a college. And so I started making more friends, which I hadn't been able to do before, and I started kind of coming into my own a little bit, but I did notice sort of around sophomore year of high school, kind of like a lot more of the VP elements started coming in. I was exceptionally insecure from the bullying and like I needed sort of constant validation from my friends. I struggled to maintain friendships. Like, obviously, when you're in high school, we don't always say and do the right things, but if a friend wronged me, like, I just completely cut them out of my life. And, like, if they did attempt to sort of apologize and, like, establish a connection, like, I could not stay present. Like, I could not let go of the wrong that they had done me. So, maintaining
Oh, I still struggle with that.
same.
I still find that so hard. Yeah.
Same.
It's probably like the one thing that I find the hardest still to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. And, like, I'm still pretty early on in my journey, but, like, that's one thing that I'm really hoping that I can kind of correct because I right now really don't have that much of a community. I have, like, 2 friends from high school that I'm really close to and maybe, 2 friends from my previous role, but I don't have a community, and there's nothing worse than, having a child and realizing that, like, you don't really have a community around you.
Can I ask a couple questions just like for some extra context? So when you went to that, did you say it was like an academy school or something? Like a
It was an
for
academies program, yeah.
okay. So did you experience bullying there as well, or was it primarily just in your first school where it was like a very already tight-knit community?
It was primarily in my first school. That being said, I did have issues with people when I did get to the academies, but I really think it was more of my BPD coming through.
Mhm. Okay. And then I truthfully don't know much about Albania. So I'm curious, like culturally, what is that like in terms of like being able to speak to your family about bullying or like mental health? Yeah, your face is telling me that that is definitely not a thing, which I would have assumed. But what is the kind of predominant like cultural values there?
Yeah, so in terms of bullying, you are able to sort of discuss that with your family. However, the take is always like, you just do unto them how they do unto you. Obviously, that's not the values that we teach here. There, it wasn't really out of the ordinary to sort of see people committing acts of violence. That's just what they knew. If you have done something to hurt me, I'm going to find a way to get you back for that. I don't want to say that, borderline was prevalent in that country. However, I do see a lot of borderline tendencies in my family members. And there's a part of me that questions whether that's a genetic component or maybe cultural learnings.
or both. Probably
or
both,
both,
realistic.
or both.
But that's really interesting because like culturally, it sounds like there's a huge like justice component to like maybe not
Yes.
like justice in like the way that we would think about that in North America, but like eye for an eye kind of thing, which would make the thing that you're struggling with around like devaluation and idealization really hard. And same with like the black and white, like, no, you wronged me once, I'm cutting you out forever. Like it's almost like you're compounding, like you've got the BPD challenges with that. And then like culturally, there's even if you don't live there anymore, there's probably still like a huge component of that that you're gonna have to try and figure out like what you want to be like in that context too.
Absolutely. And I think that for me, part of the reason why today was such a struggle for me with my borderline is because I was interacting a lot with family members who are Albanian and really do like, and it, again, it took me 14 years of therapy and an IOP and inpatient for me to finally realize this last couple of months where I struggle in those connections because of that mindset. It is very hard for me to maintain relationships with these people who I guess constantly like keeping score, if that makes sense. This idea of, well, you didn't come to this event, so I'm not going to come to this for you, or you said this, so I'm going to retaliate in this way, especially if they're sort of tallying up things that I've done in my more dysregulated years, in my more dysregulated moments, makes it exceptionally difficult for me to sort of foster a healthier relationship moving forward and really recover. It's next to impossible. One of the things that I'm kind of exploring in therapy now is what that will look like for me moving forward. Obviously, I want to work hard to sort of emulate positive relationships for my children. That includes familial bonds as well. And it's, where do I sort of draw that line on what is something that's recoverable and acceptable for me that will still allow me to maintain my own values as true? And what is something that's exceptionally toxic that there is no recovery and these are things that I do need to remove from my life? And then if that is the case, really looking at the person and saying, how much of that is you and how much of it was the really like I don't wanna say toxic, but perhaps more negative-minded culture that we were raised in. We were also sort of raised in a culture in terms of mental health where whenever I would kind of because initially I didn't realize that this was borderline. I think when I really started manifesting symptoms, it started with a lot of self-harm in addition to sort of the constant need for validation and then the cycles of idealization and devaluation. And obviously the aggression, which I hadn't had a romantic relationship at that time, so that didn't really register to me as a symptom just yet. But I always thought that I had severe depression because of the self-harm, and the suicidal ideation. And when I would attempt to sort of talk to my parents about it, and this isn't a knock on them, my parents love me to death, but their thing was always, "Just don't focus on it, just
Yeah.
focus on school, focus on getting into college, focus on, the SATs, like, this will pass," and that's what I always thought, so I always had a lot of shame around how much I was struggling. I would sometimes talk to my friends about it, however, while we all had issues in our teens, my intensity, and I guess the extent that I would have some of my issues was not something that they could relate to me on. I know for a fact when I had my first attempt and I was talking to my friends afterwards, they were just like, "I just never realized it was that bad for you." So I did feel very and still do, even post IOP, like I still do feel very isolated, um, with sort of everything that I have going on. But for me, like high school was challenging, and definitely I think people took a lot of my intensity, and didn't quite understand what was going on. I also think that, when I was in high school back in, 2009 to 2012, mental health was becoming more of a hot topic, but it wasn't what it boomed into, I want to say, like 5 years later. So there was definitely a lot more of she's intentionally awful versus like
Right.
maybe she's going through issues.
Well, and so I'm 30. I'm gathering you're 29-ish. Is that right?
31.
Oh, 31. Okay, sorry. Math is not my strong suit. But we're basically the same age, went through high school about the same time. I'm in Canada, you're in the States, but I'm sure it's not that different. And
Hmm.
like, yes, mental health was becoming more common to talk about, but it was the depression and anxiety. Like, there's no
Yes.
way in hell I would have talked about self-harm or suicide or psychosis or anything like that. Like, that wasn't on the topic, and that was still very stigmatized.
Absolutely. And I would say that for me, things have gotten better, but like for example, with my PTSD this week, I have been experiencing a lot of psychosis. And I was told by many people, don't tell your therapist, because I have had so many therapists in the past, like as soon as they hear that, um, act as mandated reporters and go ahead and notify authorities, even when I've made it clear that I have no intention to harm myself. Actually, the last CPS case that was initiated was because I admitted to being in an IOP, working on my mental health for a serious mental illness, and my children's daycare, without gathering additional context, called CPS on me.
Um,
Which, I mean, no harm done. They closed the case. They're just like, yeah, you're seeking care. Everything's fine. I was advised to not be so open about my mental health.
like,
And I did internalize that. And I was like, yep, I'm
yeah,
probably never going to say anything.
100%. But like the thing is like this is why stigma exists, right? It's like not you, obviously, but we're taught to hide our true selves in certain situations because we don't want child protective services called, or we don't want to be institutionalized against our will, or whatever it is. And then they turn that around and call us manipulative. And it's like, no, no, it's not manipulative, it's survival. And it's just like the stigma. I know there's so many parents, especially in very similar circumstances, where like the last thing in the world that they're going to want to do is try and access help because it's potentially going to come back and hurt them, in the sense that like people won't trust them around their kids.
Right.
And it's like, whoa, that's the exact opposite of how this should work. Like, people that are accessing care for their kids or for themselves should be like applauded for being brave and like doing what they need to do to make themselves well and thus make their family well. You see the same in pilots, right? And I know we're going to talk a little bit about your profession, and I'm curious to know how that's gone. But like pilots, a lot of the time will not admit to having mental health issues because they're worried about losing their ability to fly planes. Well,
Yes.
getting care, then like maybe we should encourage that. It's wild.
Yeah, I mean, and that's I think exactly like the point of why I struggled for as many years as I did. If anything, that I would want anyone to take away from my story is that, if we are sort of open to allowing people to talk about their issues and not jumping to conclusions and immediately taking the agency away from them to seek care in a way that is convenient for them, you are going to lead to people rejecting care and making that recovery take so many years. Like, it hurts for me to admit this, but it's the truth of I likely would have caused a lot less harm to myself and to others if I hadn't been so judged for the times where I would seek help. And if I felt that I could actually count on my social supports and my care team to take care of me in an appropriate way. Um, I think that's actually kind of a really good segue into like college and then my professional career, because I would say that as bad as that was, it started kind of getting worse in college, where I had my first real romantic relationship. And I do feel really bad for him because it kind of happened in an opportune time where I, shortly before college, was sexually assaulted. And essentially, following my sexual assault, that's where I developed PTSD. I was having sort of recurring nightmares. I was having a lot of psychosis. Certain things, for example, going to a college party would trigger me to have a lot of visual and auditory hallucinations. Um, I would kind of have flashbacks to the event. And so I was in a constant state of irritation, and that made my BPD significantly worse. That's where the aggression really started for me. And I think he dealt with the brunt of it. And I'm very, very ashamed of my behavior towards him. He's an example of like me trying to live my amends. That relationship is so irreparably destroyed that like I can't make amends to him, but I can do my best to try to not do that again moving forward. But I think that sort of the college atmosphere was really bringing my BPD out. In the past, I had done very well academically, because of my BPD and my PTSD and my OCD, because my checking behaviors were really, really bad at that time. My checking behaviors tend to become a lot more amplified whenever I'm in a state of emotional distress, and like, what could be more distressful than that? So, like,
Yeah.
I was so bad to the
What kind of
point.
checking behaviors are you like locks and that kind of thing or
Locks, and then for me, it's also, like, just trying to get everything in my space just the way I need it. So I would spend, like, hours upon hours, like, checking that everything was in my room, that I had my pepper spray exactly where I needed it. I had a second copy hidden, like, right under my door mat and things like that. So just to the point where, like, I was so anxious that, like, I really wasn't able to go to class. That wasn't the interpretation at the time. I did run into a lot of issues with my university of I wasn't going to class, so I was failing my exams, and I was eventually dismissed. I basically had the option of like taking classes at another university, and if I got a B or above, I could go back to my school. Obviously, I tried at two different universities, and it was like the same thing. It was the exact same thing. I kept failing. And the cycle of failure would cause me to feel so much shame and really cause me to, like, I had a lot of confidence in myself academically. I started losing that. Like, I was slowly like deteriorating and breaking down to the point where like I was essentially non-functional for a long time. I wasn't taking classes. I was sitting in my room and just painting anything that I could to kind of cope. And, like, when I look at my paintings from that time, they're super dark.
hmm.
But eventually, like, I did succeed. I got the grades and I went back to school. I wasn't failing anymore. And in that time, like, I had sought therapy. They hadn't diagnosed me with borderline yet, but they had diagnosed me with severe depression, and had done some process work for my sexual assault. So when I went back to university, I was very impulsive, very impulsive. A lot of my friends had already graduated by that time and moved on. They would keep in contact with me, but they were always just like, "Oh, we're gonna go to this bar. Let's meet up." And that obviously wasn't very conducive for my PTSD at all.
right, yeah.
I was terrified of losing my friendships, that fear of abandonment of like, if I don't do this, then I'm gonna have no one. So I kind of started spiraling. I wasn't failing anymore, but I was like just barely passing and starting to use substances. I think the only thing that really stopped me from getting addicted was my OCD, the fear of like losing control and hurting myself or others. It really kept me from taking things too far, but like I was putting myself in a ton of debt trying to take and retake classes to get better grades, impulsive spending, like, I was numbing myself as much as I could by, like, trying to go to these bars that I didn't really have the money for, trying to find sort of other means, buying clothes, buying experiences with, quote, unquote, "new friends" that probably weren't really my friends to begin with. And I was really spiraling, and that's when I met my partner now. He was very confident. We met at a sort of a social Greek event. My sorority was doing a thing with this frat, and we kinda hit it off. But it was, again, very tumultuous relationship. I was really taken by his confidence and ended up becoming pregnant maybe about 3 months into our relationship, and we decided to keep the baby. And Ollie was born 9 months later, and that for me was, like, the best thing that could have happened. I
Were you still in university at that time?
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
That's a lot to go through. Holy.
Yeah, I had my son when I was 25 years old and still needing to finish out my senior year. Because I actually was passing, barely, but passing, my school basically worked with me and said, "Okay, like, we're gonna have you go on a medical leave, and when you come back, like, you can still finish out," which for me was great because at this point, I had a little one to support. So I basically just decided, "Okay, like, you're going to get it together for your son." And I started seeking mental help, again, diagnosed with depression, but showing a lot of borderline symptoms. Around that time, my partner started sort of having some issues with the fact that, he was a young father and was effectively trying to hold on to the same lifestyle that his friends were living, the constant going out and stuff like that, which at first I didn't mind. I actually kind of liked being at home with the baby. But then when he cheated, the BPD aspects became really heightened. I went from being super loving, and really thinking that he was the greatest thing ever to being like, "Wow, you are just the worst person." And we're still together, but it's something that, like, has been a huge challenge for us to work through, and I mean, now we have 2 kids, so I'm really hoping again that with therapy, this is going to be something that I can move forward, and not continue to suffer from. I think for me also, like, what I've been attempting to do is really working hard on mindfulness and saying like, "Hey, why are you really angry at him right now? Like, what is the thing that he did now in this moment, not a day ago, not 6 years ago?" Which has been helping a little bit. I'd actually be kind of curious to hear his take on that whole thing, but I think we're getting towards a better place. But it wasn't until the cheating where that was also when I had my first attempt, and I wasn't conscious, so I was involuntarily hospitalized. Voluntarily at first, and then I said, "Okay, I wanna go home," and they're just like, "Well, you can't go home." I
Just
attempted
kidding, it's not voluntary.
Yeah, I attempted to appeal, and, in my state, I essentially, like, lost all rights to myself to make medical decisions, financial decisions. I was put in an institution for 2 weeks where I to be honest, like every time I think back on that experience, I'm not sure what the goal was because they weren't having me do DBT. They told me that I had received a diagnosis. They didn't want to tell me what the diagnosis was, but that I had one.
Why is this so common? It just like pisses me right off every time. There's probably, I would say there's probably like 40 people that we've talked to on the podcast that have that experience. And like, if not more. And it's just like, why, you guys?
Yeah, I mean, it's completely unproductive because for me, as an engineer, we're taught how to solve problems. If you tell me what I have, I will know how to treat it. And I think the worst thing about it was like I was put in an institution with people with all sorts of issues, which was like a breeding ground for dysregulation for me. We didn't do any DBT. We would kind of sit in a circle and like everyone could talk about their problems, which would sometimes trigger my PTSD, sometimes trigger my BPD. It was a really rough time. I remember like constantly being on the phone with my partner or with my parents and being like, you have to get me out of here. You have to get me out of here right now. Like it was really bad. And then when I eventually did finally come out of that, I was not right for like about a solid month after. I was trying to get back to my life. I had just graduated at that time with my Bachelor of Engineering in Biomedical Engineering and was working at BD. Um, and I had just started, so I was really like trying to make a good impression, trying to move to a full-time role from contract because COVID had made finding a job so difficult. And also trying to do that while in the back of my mind knowing that like, hey, 2 days ago, you were in a hospital. And being told that like you
Against your will.
against my will and being told that like you're not mentally competent and a whole bunch of other things which were honestly some of the worst things for me to hear. I did end up kind of pushing through and doing therapy that whole time with my private therapist. It was an interesting experience with that therapist because I had worked with her in terms of couples counseling with my partner. We eventually canceled couples counseling because we couldn't afford it. We had both just graduated, and I was already working full time and trying to pay for my Master of Engineering, which I'm still trying to finish right now. And he was working full time to sort of help support all of us. So there was a lot going on, and we just couldn't keep doing couples counseling. And she reached out to me and she said, "I've been thinking about you. And I was wondering if, you would want to continue together, but sort of pay me under the table." Which I don't know how ethical that would be by US guidelines. But she was the one who finally said, from knowing you this long, I think you have borderline personality disorder. I don't want to take up too much of our session by talking to you about it. So I'm going to let you go online and sort of read about it,
No,
which was awful. I completely rejected that diagnosis. I was like, that isn't me, even though
duh.
deep down I,
You Wikipedia BPD for the first time, and you're literally just like, that's not me.
yeah,
How could that be me? I'm not a horrible person. And then once you start looking at better resources, you're like, okay, maybe this is me. But like, no, never tell somebody to just Google it when you first get diagnosed. Send them to like specific good resources.
yes,
Always. That's my philosophy.
yeah, exactly. And like she didn't, not only did she not do that, but I strongly believe that she, even though she knew enough of the diagnostic criteria to diagnose me with BPD, I don't think that she was specialized in DBT at all. She would attempt to sort of treat me, by having me sort of close my eyes, and she would sort of walk me through a guided meditation with a lot of water imagery, which does sound like mindfulness meditation, but that was it. Like, I was not learning Dear Man. I was not learning Give or Fast or like anything that I could use in my day-to-day life. So I would come off of these sessions and be so dysregulated because, we would be talking about my behavior and how terrible I had been. But then I wasn't learning skills. I was like, okay, I understand that I'm being terrible, but like, what can I do so
Mhm.
that I
Now
don't
what?
do this again? So like I would
Mhm.
come off these calls like so angry, so dysregulated that I finally like was like, nope, I'm not doing therapy. Like I've been seeking help on and off for 10 years at this point, and it's just terrible. So I did quit. Then I kept sort of trying to break through in engineering. Something to be said for working sort of in a very male dominated field with a team of people who I don't feel were necessarily encouraged to pay attention to their emotional health. Sort of emotional awareness was not considered a strong suit in my field. Oftentimes, especially in new product development where I was working as an engineer, you were so focused on meeting these tight timelines. It was honestly like very, very high pressure situations with millions of dollars. And so oftentimes, like I would be completely torn apart in a meeting, how they would scrutinize everybody else. But I would come out of it and be like, they hate me. Like I am a terrible engineer. And deep down I knew because I knew that that was wrong because I wouldn't have made it so far and I wouldn't have graduated with all of these things stacked up against me if I wasn't good. But my BPD was really making me sit there and sort of take a lot of hits on myself. And I developed a very intrusive thought thanks to my OCD of you're a garbage person, which was something that I would say to myself for many years after that. I started moving up the ranks there. However, I started having a lot of interpersonal problems with people. Effectively, I started becoming very defensive, especially with people who had maybe unfairly criticized my work in the past and would effectively do the same thing to them, which I'm not proud of. It was a lot of things like, well, we should do it this way for this reason without necessarily like offering a good job or something like that. And I would have them come back to me afterwards and say, I'm not saying that what you said was wrong, but the way you said it was hurtful, which I do regret. And my response to that sadly was, right, but what about the 10 other times that you did that to me? Not exactly healthy relationships. By the end of my time there, I knew that that wasn't gonna work out. However, the job market was what it was, that I wasn't ready to leave because I didn't think that there was going to be other jobs. I Yes.
Because this was in the heart of
Yes, this was, like, 2 years ago.
yeah.
I wasn't ready to leave, and then I got pregnant with my daughter, so I was like, "Well, I guess I'm stuck here for a while longer." My manager at that time had known that I was having interpersonal problems. He had known that I was having issues with the intensity of the project and the way decisions were being made. That was having a severe impact on my life. Key driver goals were not being communicated down, so I was having to work up till like midnight and weekends often while trying to parent my son and being pregnant with my daughter. So he had assured me that for the first 6 months after she was born, I would be able to be at home with her, work from home. They weren't gonna force me in right away. I was going to be eased into it because I had been doing the work of up to, like, 2 or 3 other people to try to help them meet their goals. And when my daughter was born, I was at peace. I felt really good. I was at home for 3 months with her, and then it was time to go back to work, and within my first day back on that call, I was told, "You have to come into the office." And
And for like no real reason. It's just boomer
yeah,
mentality, go back to the office because that's what you should do.
yeah, that's effectively what I was told. "Oh, while you were out, the policy has changed, and they're actually going to start enforcing it. Like, how soon can you find a daycare and put her in?" And I mean, we did have a daycare in mind, but, like, I hadn't been preparing her to take a bottle. I had not mentally prepared for
Yeah.
that, and I needed the time to mentally prepare for that because with both my kids, because of my PTSD and my BPD, like, I struggled to send them to daycare. I even to this day, still
Mhm.
have a really hard time sending them to daycare because I'm terrified that some of the things that happened to me in my childhood will happen to them.
And
And
like,
so
like eh, we're very privileged in Canada with our mat leave. Like I get that. We get 12 to 18 months, but like 3 months
that's awesome.
is I know, but like that's not like I know that your entire country does that, but like that's not human,
No.
right? Like it's, yeah, I'm sure it's so much more difficult with BPD because you also have that abandonment issue, right? Of like now my kid
Yes.
will love on someone else. What am I going to do? Like not to project, I don't have kids, but I'm sure that that comes up for a lot of people. But like even at a year and a half, that would be a challenge. Yet alone, let alone like 3 months, your baby's a tiny little infant. Like, oh my goodness, I just can't
Yeah.
imagine.
And I was breastfeeding, and, like, you're encouraged to breastfeed for up to 2 years, so,
Yeah.
you figure
Wow.
that you'd at least let me be at home with them for half that time. Um, but that destroyed me. When I got off that call, I, like, bawled for 3 hours straight to the point where, like, my folks were like, "You need to stop this. Like, you need to just move on. It is what it is. You need to keep your job." For a month, I would sometimes bring my daughter into the office with me to try to ease the separation anxiety, but it just wasn't working. I started visiting daycares around my work so that I could at least like feed her during lunch. But I was completely mentally destroyed by this. I was crying every day. I was having a lot of suicidal ideation. I took 3 days off and I told my boss the truth, like, "Look, I'm mentally struggling with the concept of separating from my daughter. I just wasn't ready for this. I need to take 3 days to try to find a daycare and to try to figure out, like, what I'm gonna do with myself. I'd like to be able to find some time to get some help," which, again, I was probably too honest with that. When I came back to work, they had taken me off of one of the most lucrative things that I could be on in my career, and I impulsively quit. And then the next day, tried rescinding my resignation and was effectively
Oh,
told, "We think it's best if you leave,"
right.
which
Wow.
was terrible, like, the rejection after I had worked so hard, and also for me, I was completely blindsided because before this, I was constantly being told what a strong performer I was. I was getting promoted. I got promoted twice during my time there. So I couldn't believe that the same people that had been saying all these amazing things about me were now saying that you need to leave. I got on a call with HR and I
Hmm.
tried expressing like why I was struggling with this so much and was kind of told, well, we understand, but we've talked to other people on this project and, they say that this is the same thing for everyone. I did talk to my friends afterwards and I was just like, maybe they're right. Maybe, this is what everyone's experiencing and I'm just not well enough to be able to handle it. And they're just like, no, nothing about this is ethical or right. This is corporate gaslighting at its finest. So I ended up leaving and struggled to find a job for 3 months after that. I was never doing great financially because of my impulsive spending, but in that time I really went in the red and start my credit score tanked. I was shutting down mentally just I was completely traumatized by what happened to me, honestly. And then I finally got the job that I'm at now. And it wasn't for a full-time role with benefits. I was on contract, so I had no health insurance. I could pay for private insurance at $200 a week. So it'd come out to like eight to $900 a month for insurance, no sick days, no PTO.
Does your partner have insurance or anything? Like what do they
He
do?
did have insurance because he was full-time, but because we're unmarried, I couldn't partake in that. And the no PTO and no sick days was the worst because I needed to be able like, being at home and looking for a job with my daughter was not time off for me. Like, I was completely mentally destroyed, and I really needed time off to just process everything that had happened to me, and I couldn't take that because it would be unpaid. I tried pushing through for a couple months and finally was like, I either need to be inpatient or I need to find a solution. And I had been throughout that time trying to find a therapist and was getting ghosted, or was getting therapists who would say, like, you need to be inpatient, like, we can't work with you.
Because of BPD, or were there like other, like did they cite any?
No, I didn't tell them about my BPD
Mm,
because I hadn't been officially diagnosed. I had been told, like, well, I think you have it.
right.
I didn't tell them because I had read that if you tell them about your borderline,
Mhm.
sometimes they won't work with you.
That's why I
But
asked.
when I
That's
was
very common.
talk yeah, yeah, no. My symptoms were just so bad by that point that they're just like, "You're having so much suicidal ideation, you need to be impatient." And finally, my partner got on the phone and was effectively screaming at a woman being like, "She's been looking for months, like, someone has to help her, like, she needs help. She has 2 kids." And that's when they recommended Charlie Health to me. It's an intensive outpatient, and I went in and I was like, "Here's my story. Here's everything that's happened to me." And I've also been told that, like, I might potentially have borderline personality disorder, so I'll do the DBT track there. I'd like to pursue an official diagnosis because I can't fix something if I don't know what's wrong with me. And that's when I met my favorite person, which turned out to be my therapist, who diagnosed me with BPD. She started figuring out that there was something else there because I was a lot more distressed than most people with borderline that she had met. And that's when she also diagnosed me with obsessive compulsive disorder. And then when I started having repressed memories resurfacing during therapy, that's when she also officially diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder. Um, I don't know if maybe we have a couple more minutes, but yeah,
No,
that's
we can, I can stay on a little longer if you can, because this is fascinating. And actually it's funny, by the time this episode comes out, we'll have done an episode with Charlie Health.
oh,
Because yeah, they seem to be everywhere right now. So it's a really interesting
mhm.
conversation. Curious, like as your overall what your experience was like with them too.
Yeah, Charlie Health has been so great to the point where I'm honestly thinking about going back and this time doing the trauma work. Um, it is a huge time commitment, which, for me with all these barriers to treatment like breastfeeding and 2 kids, trying to finish a master's degree and a full-time job, it was difficult. However, I did manage to do it because my mental health is a huge priority.
And it's virtual, right? So that helps with some of those factors.
Totally virtual. Yeah, I think they serve US and Canada.
They don't do
Um,
Canada yet, but apparently
oh, not yet?
they're considering it, maybe.
Oh, hopefully, because I honestly strongly recommend Charlie Health.
Mhm.
And I think it was the first time for me in my sort of journey to seek mental health for myself where I felt that I could be fully honest and, like, I wasn't gonna have cops showing up at my door like, "Are you gonna hurt yourself?" which is something that had happened to me in the past so many times. I think, something to be said, like, yes, I do struggle with suicidal ideation every day, but I'm very determined to be here. Please don't call the cops.
Yeah, well, and I struggle with suicide ideation probably every day, if not every most day. I don't know. And like it doesn't mean that I'm gonna die by suicide today or tomorrow or next week. Like it's one thing for that to be
Right.
your kind of brain's go-to solution, for lack of a better word, to everything, than actually doing it. And so like I strongly believe that like you can be suicidal, you can self-harm, and you can be safe all at the same time. Like those don't have to be connected necessarily.
Yeah, and I think Charlie Health, the thing that I really liked about my care team and what I noticed of other people's care teams as well, there was sort of a lot more barriers that you had to go through before they would contact the authorities. Like I did have them, forgot what the test was called, but it was like a test that they would do before they would sort of have to mandatedly report that, like, you might harm yourself, and, like, if you fail the first part, they didn't call right away. They would just go to another part, and if you failed that one. So, it definitely seemed like a much more informed approach than I was used to. If I did mention, like, I was struggling with suicidal ideation or I was having a lot of auditory and visual hallucinations of the person who assaulted me, they weren't, like, immediately calling CPS, they were just like, "Oh, let's do this activity to work through it," or, "Here is this skill you can use, would you like to try it with us?" Like, it was a very interactive platform where I honestly learned a ton of skills that I still use to this day. I use my skills every day because I do work in a very high pressure and invalidating work environment where talking about your feelings isn't necessarily accepted. Talking about your mental health is definitely not accepted. Like, I don't think that I would be allowed to be a project manager if they knew what I struggled with. Um, which, something to be said where you can still be a very high functioning and high achieving person
Mhm.
and struggle with mental illnesses. You can hold two truths at the same time, but I don't think that the world is quite understanding of that yet, especially in a very sort of technical sector of med devices. But yeah, it's been honestly a really great experience, and I am looking to re-engage once my new insurance kicks in to try the trauma track.
That's amazing. I'd love to hear about how that goes for you because like it sounds like it was such an important step in the beginnings of your recovery, whatever that looks like. Recovery's such a funny word. But like in your wellness journey,
Yeah.
right? And the fact that it is accessible, because then you don't necessarily have to be telling your employer or your school, like, oh, I have to leave for
Hmm.
5 hours a day or whatever. Like, that's not an easy thing to like
Right.
kind of explain away. Ironically, if you had cancer, nobody would care. They would be like, oh my God, of course. Like, you have to go to chemo. Get it.
Right.
But that's not the world we live in at the moment. One day.
Sadly, no. I did find though, one thing that Charlie Health did really help me with was talking to my school because I did have obviously like with my mental health completely falling off, the taking care of children plus working full time plus finishing out my master's degree was proving to be a little bit too taxing.
Done.
So I did need to take some time off and like they helped me in a very discreet way. I did eventually confide to my advisor and the dean where I was like, this is what I have. This is what I'm doing for it. I am in care. Luckily for me, I had a really good track record in my master's. I had like a 3.9 out of a 4.0. So they were just like, yeah, we're totally going to work with you, take care of your mental health. You still have many years before your credits expire to do this. So I don't think that that would have been possible if not for my individual counselor through there. And I am kind of excited to go back and really like close the books and finish out strong there. And I mean, something to be said for all the things that my individual therapist has done, because I don't think that I would have been moved into this full-time role where I now look forward to having benefits and PTO, unlimited PTO, because this company is attempting to move forward to a more sort of mental health awareness space where you do need days sometimes. So I do get to look forward to that thanks to Charlie Health.
Oh, that's so awesome. I'm so glad to hear that. I have heard like that engineering in particular is really brutal for stigma and also just like lack of compassion when it comes to needing time. And so hopefully the shift in the organization you're working with now to like a more mental health aware model is something that actually works out in the long run.
Yeah, it it is. I think that for me, like the best way I could summarize what my interactions have been like working in an engineering environment is when I have expressed feeling invalidated or feeling perhaps overly criticized, the response has effectively been, that sounds like a personal problem.
Right. Yeah. Everybody else can handle it.
Well, you're getting offended. Yeah, and it's but you still said something that offended me, so sorry, friend, but I think you own that. Um,
Is it pretty male? It's male dominated.
yeah, I work in a team of 20 engineers, and I am one of 2 women.
All of the bosses are men.
All of the bosses are men. In my previous company, I did have one boss who was female, and she was great to talk to. However, when it came to perhaps trying to make changes to the culture for the better, she was exceptionally passive. And honestly, that's kind of what I've noticed of women in my field is that for the most part, they tend to be very passive, whereas I was very vocal, and very protective of other women that were there with me. I was honestly perhaps maybe a little too open of saying, "I don't appreciate the way you addressed so and so in a meeting. It was handled in a very sort of it was handled in a very inappropriate way where it would have caused her some emotional distress," and was told, "Well, if she has a problem with it, she can talk to me about it." When I would sort of attempt to speak to my female coworkers regarding some of the experiences that they'd had, they were uncomfortable and they were unhappy, but they were like, "Well, it's hard to find a job out there, and, like, I don't like it, but I can always gripe about this person at lunch," and so things would often go on unaddressed. Things were always kind of
Mhm.
simmering underneath the surface of people being unhappy with one another, which was also due to a lot of very toxic leadership, but issues weren't coming out into the open and being resolved in any meaningful way. Attempting to sort of report things to your manager of people saying we're doing inappropriate things was often kind of like, "Oh, yeah, I'll take it up with their manager," and then nothing would happen.
Yeah, there's no follow through or at least report back.
None. None
Yeah.
whatsoever. I think it was a valuable experience for me though, because in this time, I really did learn self-restraint to the point where I could mask well enough that the person could tell that I was unhappy with what they said. However, I was never unprofessional, which for someone who was struggling with BPD, like that for me was a huge win. It always felt so good to be able to confront someone in a healthy way, even if their response was deflection and essentially taking no accountability for their
Yeah.
behavior.
You're being the bigger person and saying like, no, this was wrong, but I'm gonna be professional and respectful about it. I mean, I think like some ways that's what Dear Man's all about.
Yes, I do use that
And
format a
give back.
lot.
Yeah, me
Yeah.
too. I use it all the time. It's funny. My poor HR department must think I'm just nuts because I'm constantly like, so I've written out this thing that I need to like whatever say And it's always in a Dear Man format, but they don't know what Dear Man is, right? So they're probably just like, why are you such a weirdo with like how you write these things out? And I'm like, it's because I need to. I'm
It's
sorry.
a really good way to objectively describe a situation and sort of avoid putting people on the defensive, I find.
Mhm.
That's the biggest thing, and I don't blame my fellow engineers for this. I think that it's been just historically men are not encouraged to be very in tune with their feelings, and their emotions. But because of that, when you do attempt to confront them regarding issues like that, they're immediately on the defensive. And putting things into your man, I find, makes them more receptive. There is still that patronizing thing of, well, you're looking at this too emotionally, and you should look at this thing
Yeah.
more rationally, where it's like,
Are you on your period? You seem like you might be on your period.
yeah, it's just
Like,
like, are
oh
you
God.
trying to imply that I'm being irrational? Because I could imply the same thing of you. It's all perspective at the end of the day, but
Mhm.
it's something that I'm slowly, like, learning to radically accept that this is just how things are going to be for a couple of years while I mean, I hate to say it, but the boomers cycle out. The new generation of engineers are a lot more socially and emotionally aware, and, of course, there's, like, initiatives being taken by companies now to encourage that.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a huge culture shift as boomers retire. Even the work from home thing, like nobody's going to work from an office anymore if they don't have to, right? Like it's that is such an
Yeah. I really hope that continues because I know one thing, conducting a job search to find this company, a lot of roles were moving to on site. And actually, that was one thing that I
Mhm.
did have to negotiate for this role to be able to be hybrid. There's nothing about my job that really can't be done from
Why
home.
is it
So
even hybrid?
why
Yeah.
do I have to be here? For 5 days a week, that seems excessive. So there's definitely that aspect of it that I'm nervous about, but hopefully stays. But I do suspect that the US will find ways to force us back in.
Yeah, I mean, I encourage everyone that's looking for a job. Obviously, it's field dependent. Like if you're gonna work at McDonald's, it's
Yeah.
easy to work from home. But like even if it says on site, apply anyway and then try and negotiate it.
Mhm.
Because a lot of the time there's flexibility if you're the
Yes.
right person. It just they don't want to say that because then you get so many more applicants because it's people from wherever that apply.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for me, again, like, the being on site is difficult for me, especially in terms of, like, masking and regulating. I pretty much get dysregulated often in my day to day. And so I do really have to work hard to use my skills. Every time I go into the office, I start my day off with gratitude journaling and mindfulness journaling to kind of kick myself off on a good note because I know that I'm going to go into a meeting and then get dysregulated because of the demands of this job, because of the way that we communicate, because of the constant shifting of priorities. And the best thing that I can do is try to use my skills in those moments and sort of ask appropriate questions and use effective coping techniques. It's funny because I've actually found that I, in a typical meeting, will show less borderline symptoms than some of my coworkers who don't have
Right.
BPD.
Yeah, because you're able to be really, really self-aware and use the skills that other people aren't necessarily using. But it's exhausting. Oh my God, every time I have to go in, because I'm
Yes.
mostly remote, but I'm like, I have to go in every once in a while. And like, if I go in for one day, it ruins my week because I'm so tired. Like,
Yes.
I just can't function. Like, I can't do my normal routine. I can't, whatever. Like, just everything about it is exhausting for me.
Yeah, and I think honestly, like, that's one thing that I've been trying to tell my family and my partner often when they're just like, "Well, why can't you do this and that?" Borderline personality disorder is physically tiring. The constant, like,
Yeah.
intense emotions, forget about up and down. Like, yes, they're positive and negative, but like, even my positive emotions are so intense that, like, sometimes I'm exhausted by them. So, I promise you, like, I'm not intentionally trying to make life difficult. I'm trying to work with what I've got.
Totally. Absolutely. Oh my goodness, it's so tiring. Okay, we are out of time, and I know that we should record another episode one day because I really want to hear about your parenting journey. So we'll leave that for today just so that this episode doesn't end up being like 2 hours long, because I'm sure we could go into it forever. But I'm ending all my episodes these days asking what your favorite parts of Borderline are.
Oh, honestly, I have so many. I think for me, my favorite part of BPD is being able to sort of impart on my kids the knowledge of really building a mentally and emotionally healthy life for yourself. I have been teaching my kids DBT skills, and we do take time of our out of our day to really like get in tune with ourselves and what we're feeling and regulate together, which for those of you who have toddlers, highly encourage them. You can breathe with them and teach them how to regulate themselves. So I think that it's made me a better mom, and like I love my kids to death. Like, you go to the park and you see parents on their phones and on their iPads. That's not me. Like, I am sliding down with them, I'm swinging with them, like, I am being a kid with them, and I think that I really wouldn't be that involved if not for my BPD.
I love that. That's beautiful. And what a good little segue into what our next episode will be.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Laura, for coming on. I've loved this conversation, and yeah, I'll reach out and we'll get in touch for second episode.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening to the Superfeeler podcast. This episode was recorded on the unceded traditional territory of the Matsqui and Sumas First Nations. If you are interested in learning more about the show, please feel free to follow us on social media. Our Instagram handle is the Superfeeler. That'll be also linked in the show notes. We also have a Patreon page where you can get all sorts of bonus content. We've got bonus episodes, video episodes, lots of resources, journal articles, all sorts of stuff. So you're going to absolutely love being on Patreon with us. There's also free memberships in addition to paid ones, so please feel free to join that. That's patreon.com/superfeeler. If you're looking for information regarding the Superfeelers Club, which is the peer support group that I mentioned in the show, please feel free to Google or look at laurieedmondson.com for information and registration.